Good morning and welcome to our Sunday morning forum on this July 4th Independence Day. We are delighted this morning to welcome the Reverend Dr. Patrick Cheng to talk to us about faith, freedom, and love in the Christian tradition, in the American tradition, and what's happening today. Patrick is both an attorney and a trained theologian. He has his law degree from Harvard and his doctorate from Union. He has been a tenured professor at Episcopal Divinity School and currently is both scholar in residence at St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue, as well as working for the Church Pension Group, for which we are grateful every day for, for at least those of us in college for the work of CPG. Also, Patrick was born on November 4th, along with wonderful members of our community, Sally Cummins and Spiro Zacharias, and me. So Patrick, welcome back. It's nice to see you.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here and really happy to be part of the November 4th Club.
Well, it's a wonderful club, at least my fellow members here at Heavenly Rest. Well, start with your journey. Attorney, theologian, talk about those calls.
So I grew up as a Roman Catholic in a Roman Catholic household, and I wanted to be a priest early on. I sort of did the play with grape juice and Wonder Bread kind of thing, right? But it's interesting that around junior high, I realized I was gay, and so that I felt like that could never be a possibility in terms of being a priest. And so in many ways, sort of went very much a secular route, studying English literature in college, and then I was a little rebellious as an Asian American. I didn't want to be a scientist or a doctor, so I decided to be a lawyer. But as you had mentioned, went to law school and went to practice. But God works in mysterious ways. I just one morning I remember waking up and just thinking to myself, I just don't know what I stand for. And around that time, I had seen a flyer for a biblical Hebrew class up at Union. And I took the class, and sort of all my love for theology and religion, Christianity came back. So that in a nutshell is just sort of the journey, and then that led to my PhD and teaching theology, but also being able to serve the church, right, and use the legal background too.
Well, you've written, taught, and shared about queer theology all over the world. Published 3 books that can translate in many languages. We've just finished Pride Month. It's an important thing for our community. Talk about, give us an introduction to queer theology and that perspective on gospel.
Sure. Well, as you and your parishioners may know, ever since the 1960s, there's been sort of a resurgence or actually rising of many different theologies for different groups, right? So with Black theologies, feminist theologies, and Latinx, Asian, disability. And so in some ways, queer theology is a theology by and for LGBTQ people, right? So in its simplest form, I think there's a pastoral aspect in the sense that many people, myself included, have been very hurt in terms of being excluded from the church to the point of even maybe being hostile. So part of it is to, apologetic in the sense of not apologizing, but that we are part of the Christian tradition too, right?
Right.
And then I think there is sort of a larger conversation. Just in terms of conversing with contemporary theology and thinking about themes, that's something too, that we're at the table, not just pastorally, but also within academia and the church. I think part of some of the questions that may come up, right, is like, well, why do you call it queer theology, right? Because oftentimes queer is seen as a sort of a negative word. And what about the Bible, and what about sin? So a lot of these questions, come up. And so there's those issues. But I'm also interested in some of the theoretical issues, like a lot about queerness is about transcending binaries, right? Male, female binaries. what's transgender. And in some ways, Christianity, I think, is profoundly non-binary, right? That Jesus is, both divine and human, right? He's not either or, he's both and. He is both, has died and lives, right? So I think, and Anglicanism, for that matter, in terms of the Catholic and Protestantism, it's so you see how that thought structure doesn't limit issues to just sexuality or gender identity. Let me just pause there. Is that helpful?
Well, it's very helpful. And how have you seen the Episcopal Church over the last 2 decades move towards this deeper understanding of ourselves, of God, of the presence of grace in community among all of us?
Yeah, I think one of the gifts of the Episcopal Church is this really recognizing the inherent dignity of all. And I felt so proud to be part of a tradition that really believes in all the sacraments for all the people, right?
Right.
And so honestly, like when I found my way back to Christianity in the late 90s, I found it through the Episcopal Church because of my love for liturgy, Anglo-Catholicism. And yet, even at that time, I felt like, any stirrings of a call just wasn't possible, even, right? I mean, and so within these decades, even though there had been LGBT folks ordained, but by that time I had already been, almost 10 years with my husband, Michael. And so I've seen the denomination evolve, and I realize it's also at the heart of a lot of tension within the Anglican communion. But just as I believe in non-binary categories, I'm hoping it can be a both and, that people can understand our charism, but also preserve the tradition and the larger communion.
And in that way, it's very Anglican.
Yes, exactly. And I think my own story, both being Roman Catholic, and then, I wrote my dissertation on Karl Barth and Reformed theology. In some ways, my whole theology is a product of the two. And so Anglicanism, Episcopalianism feels very much at home.
So as a pastor, what would you say to others who have been hurt by LGBTQ community members who have been hurt by the church, to invite them to come and experience Christian community again?
Yeah. So I think, I've always been impressed by examples where people can apologize and acknowledge the hurt that has been done. And I also think that a lot goes, in terms of just not being always so nervous as to what's going to come out of the pulpit. I know I've been in a lot of situations where you're just like, what is the person going to say, right? And to know that that's, that people are welcome and children of God. And I think also just to, in terms of icons, not just written, drawn icons, but just, in terms of real life people, incarnational people who identify, as LGBTQ. And so I think those are a lot of things that are important in terms of the welcome.
Thank you for that. And thank you for that overview. So let's talk about freedom in the wide Christian tradition. The collect says to serve you is perfect freedom. How do Christians understand faith and freedom and our theology? And has it changed over 2 millennia, or has been a distinct pattern?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think freedom is so important to the Christian tradition, the theological tradition. And to answer your question, I think it has evolved. It has both stayed the same, but also has evolved depending on the times. So, for example, I think so much of the Hebrew Bible is about the Exodus story, right? And freedom from Egypt and Pharaoh. And so much about Christian theology is about freedom from original sin, right? And Jesus frees us from our sins through atonement. But I think, even in terms of like those specific questions, the early church, right? A lot of the debates, we see that in the Pauline epistles, was about whether Christians would be free from the Jewish law, right? Galatians is all about the debate over circumcision, right? In the Council of Jerusalem. So, I could give a lot of examples, but I think what's really The Reformation in terms of Martin Luther, he was a monk and he kept on trying to, sort of save himself through works, right? And it's like hitting the head against the wall. And he finally came up with, in reading scripture that it wasn't about ourselves. We're saved by God's grace. And that frees us then, ironically, to serve, right? Going back to what you're saying. So freedom is not just the antinomian, like no laws, but it actually frees us from energies that could be aimed at a much more productive way. So those are some initial thoughts. Does that sort of...
It absolutely does. And in thinking about what I understand about these categories, and just to tell our community, we asked Patrick to talk about faith, freedom, and love. And then I went back and said, well, how do you want to talk about this? Because I wasn't quite sure how to categorize it. So he's provided a structure in which we're chatting today, for which I am very grateful. But looking back, you looking at Paul and Luther and the sense of grace as free grace, providing us with the freedom then to live a Christian life. I think John Paul said, it's freedom not to do as you want, but to do as you ought. And the question is how do we understand that as the service is freedom?
Right, because I think there's a lot of debate within the Christian community, right or left, as to what freedom means, and especially for LGBTQ folks, right? Like, does freedom actually mean to be celibate, right? I mean, that is, and so I think discernment as to what scripture means in the tradition is really done in community. That's why, having these conversations are important. But I will say that a lot of contemporary theological reflection, Karl Barth, the great 20th century theologian, right, actually defines God as loving freedom, like these two characteristics, right? So everything about creation, incarnation, and the nearness that we have with the Trinity is about love. And, sort of the traditional characteristics of God, like omnipotence and omniscience, right? All powerful is about freedom. So when you put the two together, it's really about loving freedom, right? And if we're made in the image of God, then we are also called to loving freedom, right? I mean, and so people hear Barth and they're like, oh, he's just so conservative, biblical. But isn't it amazing? Like at the heart of God is loving freedom, right? And then, liberation theologians too, right? Whether it's Cohen or Gutierrez, it's about freedom from economic oppression or political or racial oppression. So.
Well, so you talked about the last generation and the powerful flowering of theology in many voices from many perspectives, of which James Cone and Gustavo Gutierrez and the liberationists are a major part. And you've mentioned Exodus, which is a key narrative in liberation theology. Describe this movement towards freedom in the last generation, maybe starting with Gutierrez and what that means and the liberationist understanding of Christian tradition.
Yeah, well, I think, part of the flowering of different kinds of theologies arose out of a critique of theology just being in the head and just being theoretical and having no impact, right? I mean, and I think Pope Francis is a good example of the importance of, incarnational and fleshed, we're talking about people, right? And so I think with Gutierrez and Latin American liberation theologies and the oppressions in terms of the economic and political, I think the Exodus story becomes something not just for Passover, but also the importance of leaving behind, enslavement and going into the promised land, right? And we also see this in the civil rights movement, Dr. King and I Have a Dream, and his, freedom speech. But I think, part of it is just acknowledging the enfleshedness of how theology has to impact, real lives and free us from those oppressions. But I think also, it just to acknowledge that theology isn't done in a vacuum. Theology is done by real people and real social locations. And to be able to talk about that, I think is not only helpful, is critical. And that's why it's so important to have this plurality of voices in terms of contemporary theology.
So let me venture something. So is part of, in the last generation, the freedom from past dogma that doesn't meet our current incarnation with the faith?
Well, I think, as I mentioned before, I think Christian freedom is not just do whatever you want, right? There is a sense of, you're both freed, but then you serve, right? In the same way, I think the beauty of the Christian tradition, but I'm biased because I'm a systematic theologian, is that you are in conversation, right, with millennia. The beauty of ecclesiology, with the laying on of hands, traditions like the Anglican Episcopal tradition and the Roman tradition, where there's apostolic succession. I mean, we are not, we didn't invent sort of these theological categories. And sometimes I think, it's often said that sin is, incurvatus in se, just looking in on yourself. And I think it's really easy for us to do that. And one corrective is to realize that we are part of a long tradition of voices, and that come before us and will continue after us too.
So we're in conversation. Yeah, so Anglican balance of being experienced in tradition both, I guess. Go ahead, Patrick. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say too that sort of radical love. I think my argument is that LGBTQ love is a radical love, so radical that it sort of dissolves boundaries. But the bulk of the book is really applying that notion to the traditional systematic theology categories. So it's sort of like, hopefully people are interested in that, but they also get some theology too, right? So anyway.
Would talk about sin in this context as thinking about freedom. If follow Karl Barth, that if God is loving freedom, then what is sin?
Yeah. And so part of my dissertation writing about Barth was about Barth's notion of sin, which I think is really fascinating, and also other Neo-Orthodox theologians. I guess the best way to describe it is that feminist theologians have said, so the tradition has been that sin, the greatest sin is pride, right? That you are too much into yourself and then you forget about God and neighbor. But feminist theologians and Neo-Orthodox theologians have said that the flip side is also true, that sin can also be not raising yourself up high enough, right? So if you sort of dissolve into the background, or if you think you're not good enough to come forward, that can be a sin also. And the reason why, and both are true because they oppose the revelation of Jesus, right? So Jesus's cross and descent into hell, you're opposing that when you're too proud. But the resurrection, when you don't recognize the resurrection, that's the sin of self-abnegation, right? So queer theology, I argue, is really about sort of opposing what we know about Jesus in the Gospels. So often sin is about lists of do's and don'ts, right, in the Pauline epistles. Right. But what's at the core of Jesus? Revelation. So if you oppose revelation, I would argue the closet is sin. Do you see what I'm saying? So I think sort of that's just one way of thinking about sin and grace that is really deeply rooted, I think, in the Christian tradition.
That's very helpful. So tell us, for our community, what is a Neo-Orthodox theologian?
Sure. Well, I think just the newspaper highlighted or something, just the headline, is that with 19th century theologies, it very much turned inwards to humanity, right? So you sort of had the Enlightenment, and you had sort of philosophical theology, and then it was sort of about again turning to the human beings. But Neo-Orthodox theologies, people like Karl Barth said that no, we instead of saying that it's about mankind or humanity, it's really about God and God's otherness, right? So Neo-Orthodox, the Orthodox is the tradition recognizing the traditional language about God, but it's neo-new in terms of how it's applied to daily life. So I think that's just sort of the mid 20th century.
Well, let's talk about freedom and faith in the American tradition. We talked a little bit about John Locke, life, liberty, and property not as just things, but as self, as inalienable rights given to us by God, which is so much part of the aspiration of our tradition. We're going to talk both about the aspiration and how we struggled to reach it over 200 years of freedom. But give some context. Where is freedom in the American tradition, American religious tradition?
Well, I think in many ways, I'm a first generation immigrant. And so even though I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, I was born in Hong Kong and my parents moved here. And so I sort of 1.9 generation, not quite second generation, but pretty darn close, right? And I think, sort of the welcoming of immigrants and being a beacon of light to the world, right? Literally the Statue of Liberty. I think there's something beautiful about that. There's something beautiful about our founding story and sort of, in terms of shedding sort of the British Empire and coming into our own. Mm-hmm. And I think, so it's a both and thing. I think it's important that many people, I was talking to a colleague just yesterday, and the colleague was saying, well, Independence Day, the 4th of July, didn't speak to me because I was only 3/5 of a person, right? And so I think, many in our church, Byron Rushing, Vice President of the House of Deputies, every year sends out an email sort of reminding us that the Independence Day Collect talks about sort of our freedom, right? But he's like, is that really true? And so the original sin of slavery, for example, is something that we need to remember. So I think it's a both and. I think it's aspirational, but I think there is also repentance that needs to happen.
What you mentioned when we're preparing 1852 address by Frederick Douglass on what is the 4th of July to a slave. It's really, seminal work in American history, but a powerful critique, not only of American government, but the church. Describe what Douglass was saying in that address.
Yeah, it's such an amazing piece, and I commend all those watching to go out and Google, right? Douglass's speech. My understanding was actually delivered on July 5th because he refused to deliver it on July 4th, but he was invited to speak in Rochester, and it's a very sort of sharp critique of what July 4th means, and along the lines of what my colleague said, right? And this was before the Civil War, and but it was during the time of the abolitionist debates. And I think some of the passages he actually sort of critiques. He talks to people of faith, saying, "Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to the slave mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages." I mean, and so I think, rhetorically, it's so powerful. But it is, I think the larger question is, well, who is excluded when we celebrate the 4th of July and Independence Day? Always asking that question.
Well, and he takes on the church directly and its support in North and South of fugitive slave laws, and that the gospel that the church has proclaimed is not a gospel of freedom, but a gospel of confinement. And it's, certainly historically, it presents a very sharp critique, but it leads us to ask now, in what ways are we understanding religious freedom, our faith, and this grace that you described as proclaimed from our pulpits or not?
Right. I'm really struck by sort of the theological underpinnings of that particular speech, and I think it's telling. You mentioned last month, Pride Month, also the fact that Juneteenth was finally made a federal holiday, right? And in terms of, I think the official name for Juneteenth is also Juneteenth as Independence Day, right? June 19th, right? In terms of sort of the actual abolition of slavery. And so I think that's something that's really important too in terms of history. there is a very positive strand. But I think, social location, I mentioned this before, right? It's relative, it's not absolute. In some contexts, as an Asian American, I might be seen as very much on the margins. In other contexts, like the Asian American Conference, my being male and, cisgender might actually be seen as part of the oppressor. And so I think an important thing for all of us to think about is who's still not included. And I think, if we are willing to acknowledge the fact that this American story is not done, but continues, I think that would be a powerful way to celebrate Independence Day and the 4th of July.
Well, so religious freedom is a current debate in American public life, and particularly in relation to the Supreme Court. Again, asking a big question for maybe a headline look. What are the two clauses that relate to religion in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights? And then let's talk about freedoms in that context.
Sure. Yeah. So the First Amendment, as you know, has the religion clauses, and it has the Establishment Clause on the one hand and the Free Exercise Clause on the other. And I like to think of them as somewhat in tension, both actually in favor or supporting religious freedom, but the Establishment Clause is to prevent the government from collapsing church and state too much, right? So the government can't establish an official religion. And, that has the benefit of allowing many different faiths and, religions to exist. On the other hand, the Free Exercise Clause is about, sort of allowing the freedom for people of faith to, to actually live out what we believe. And so the government, is also limited, but in this case, limited to stopping us and telling us what we can or cannot do in terms of worship. But then again, there will be times when rights clash. And I think the free exercise, the rights clashing, is something that has really been front and center for the Supreme Court.
So talk about the free exercise call and what's happening now, because it really is front page news this summer.
Yeah. Just recently in June, the Supreme Court had decided the Fulton versus City of Philadelphia case, and the headline again is sort of 9-0, ruled in favor of Catholic social services that had refused to sign a non-discrimination provision in their contract with the City of Philadelphia. Right, they were hired to screen foster parents, and they said, because we're Roman Catholic, we cannot do the screening. And so the City of Philadelphia said, well, then if you can't sort of do this, then I'm sorry, but we can't use you for that process. And so that just sort of went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court did sort of rule in favor of Catholic social services, but it was a very, very narrow ruling. And in fact, it was really 6-3 in terms of its relationship to the Smith case. And so, I could go into that too, but let me just pause. I mean, that's sort of an overview of what happened in that case.
Well, so yeah, I'd like to hear about the underlying case, because so as not an attorney, they chose not to overrule a precedent, which may be now in jeopardy based on a concurrent opinion that one justice wrote. But it seems like one of the questions in the Fulton case is a clashing sense of what religious freedom means between different parts of, let's just take the Christian faith. And we draw this out, which you can, as both a theologian and an attorney, you can amend. But our Roman Catholic sisters and brothers would say religious freedoms means that they should not be required to do things which are contrary to their doctrine. In this case, recognizing same-sex couples. The Anglican tradition, Episcopal Church, would say that sacraments, the sacramental generosity, is so much a part of our freedom and our freedom in God, that recognizing that is exactly an expression of our religious faith. And so we have two within one tradition, and within, maybe to say, the small c Catholic view of tradition, there are two different points of view about what this means. How do you analyze this and improve on my cosmology of the
Right.
situation?
Well, I think this, I mean, you stated it perfectly in terms of sort of the diversity of thought that's even within Christian theology, right? This flowering of theologies that we were talking about. What the government should never do, in my view, is to, sort of make a theological judgment as to which one is correct or not. I mean, I think our job as theologians in Ephesus, and pastors is to sort of state what we think, but that's our realm, not the realm of the government, right? And I think that's why this Smith case is so important, right? That this was written by Justice Scalia in 1990, and it was, in response to, two men who had smoked peyote as part of their religious ceremonies, but they were also anti-drug counselors. So they were actually dismissed from their job. And so they applied for unemployment insurance and they were denied because they had violated a law against, using drugs. And so this went all the way up. And Justice Scalia actually said it was okay to deny them the benefits. Why? Because the law was neutral and generally applicable, right? So a general law, like even if it has an impact on religious practice, should be okay. Why is that important? Well, non-discrimination laws, right, we like to think are neutral and generally applicable. And so therefore, what applying Smith, what a lot of people are saying is that, look, under sort of, you can't say as a person of faith, I won't apply, I won't, abide by these anti-discrimination laws. And you should be protected under the Supreme Court's doctrine. And so I think that's why there was such a debate. I think it was important that Smith was not overruled. People weren't sure what the court would do.
Well, so two questions. One, purely as an attorney, reading the court and these cases that are coming forward, where do you see this Supreme Court moving with this? It was widely decided, but on a narrow basis. There was some question about overruling Smith, which they did not do. If you had to project out and prognosticate about 5 years from now, where does it seem like they're heading with this, their understanding of this evolving doctrine?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, I think just getting back to the very, very narrow ruling, right? Remember, I was sort of saying the Smith, the only laws that would sort of be upheld would be neutral and generally applicable. And they argued that this was not a generally applicable law because it gave discretion, right, to a government official to turn down someone. And so that was sort of the ruling that the normal liberals joined, and along with the Chief Justice and Justice Kavanaugh and Justice Barrett. And Justice Barrett wrote a concurrence about saying that, all's well and good if you want to overrule Smith, but it creates so many more problems, right? Like how do you deal with this question then? Do you go back to the pre-Smith rule and all that? But in terms of your question about, sort of predicting, I mean, I think it might be a fool's errand, but nonetheless, it's interesting that two major cases about LGBT rights and religion, oftentimes popular culture sort of says that they're in sort of diametrically opposed, that they're binary, right? But I know that's not true. But both were decided on very narrow grounds. The Masterpiece Cake Shop case was about the baker who did not want to do a gay wedding cake, right? But instead of, again, overruling Smith and saying, the Colorado statute wasn't good, they found a reason to say that rule wasn't neutral, that people actually, sort of spoke ill of the baker and therefore, it was non-neutral. So my point is being that it's interesting that both of these cases were decided very narrowly. It may be that the court does not want to go there, may not want to go there yet. But again, just in terms of a few years down the road, one thing that, a lot of people may not put together is recently with COVID legislation, right? There have been cases, right, where churches have said, listen, you state, you cannot tell us, how many people are restricted or we have to wear masks or whatever, because you're not doing the same thing with other people. And so it's almost like this, if there are exemptions over there, they should apply to religion also. I think that's where the court is moving. But again, time will tell.
The Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn brought that case against New York State and won in the court on right before Thanksgiving last fall. Well, okay, so ask another dimension of that question. Put on both your hats as theologian and attorney, and you're writing the new doctrine about this from the court or argument before the court. How would you draw from both perspectives free exercise, the current understanding of the free exercise call, if you were to write the doctrine, the legal doctrine?
Right. Well, it's interesting that I remember when Smith, sort of first came out, and I was in law school, and people were so shocked by it. It seemed so radical because the result came out against sort of religious minorities, right? But now we're sort of using it because I don't think back in 1990 people would have imagined sort of neutral laws, non-discrimination laws protecting LGBT people. That being said, and so I think in many ways, I think Smith should be seen as good law. I do think one issue that the Fulton case didn't really deal with and that took a lot of time in the briefs and in oral argument, was the role of government contractors, right? It's one thing if the government comes in and says, hey, you can't do X, Y, and Z because, that's illegal. I mean, that could be seen as overreaching. It's another thing to say, I would like to provide some kind of service voluntarily, right? Like providing foster children services. And as a condition of it, no one's forcing you to do that. So as a condition of that service, you have to abide by certain rules, right? And so I would sort of say that in terms of a general contractor rule, that should be an exception for free exercise, that the government can sort of say, all right, fine, if you want money, within certain boundaries, you have to do X, Y, and Z. So if I'm a food bank or a soup kitchen, I can't refuse to serve people who aren't Christian, right? I mean, and so in fact, our presiding bishop, Michael Curry, had filed an amicus brief in this case saying that actually non-discrimination rules help religious liberty. They don't harm it, right? And so I think those are just some thoughts as I come out. And the larger point too is just how proud I am that the PB, also president of House of Deputies, Episcopal Divinity School, all filed amicus briefs with different theories, but supporting the city of Philadelphia.
So back up to all of us who aren't trained theologians and attorneys, and give pastoral advice. You described, well, the whole thing, the widespread sweep of Christian tradition, our American tradition, where we're struggling with our aspirations, and then what's happening right now in our courts, but what happened in the courts is reflecting what's happening in communities. How should we as practicing Christians, as people of faith, try to understand freedom and our wider traditions, both American and Christian?
Right. Well, I think robust debate and both speaking up, but more importantly, speaking within communities as to what our values are, is such an important part of what I believe we're called to do. And I think, again, the Episcopal Church, people aren't shy in terms of, sort of talking about what we believe is right and just. I think that's important. I think hope is important, that sometimes it's really, as we work towards, sort of ideals, there will be setbacks, but, we can't live in Good Friday. We always have to remember we're Easter Sunday people too, right? And it may feel like we might also be in Holy Saturday in terms of suspended, sort of. But I think that's one important piece. I think like the Frederick Douglass speech and other notions about freedom, I think having debates and learning about our history is important too. And as I mentioned earlier, I think really thinking about who is excluded, right? I mean, I think myself as an Asian American, like I don't think I ever learned in high school history or elementary school history about the 200,000 Chinese Americans that were brought over as indentured servants to complete the Transcontinental Railroad, right? I remember in my elementary school, there was a drawing of, the last spike, where the two trains come together.
Right.
How many Chinese Americans did you see there? I mean, none, right? I mean, and people, that was like indentured servitude. And so I think there is this history about celebrating freedom, but also where have we come short? And where are we short now too, to this day? And it's okay because, whether it's original sin or whatever, we're always going to come short. We need God's grace.
Yeah, all of our conversations and debates are in the context of grace and a God who loves us in freedom, and vice the same.
Exactly. And I think this is where the Reformation background for our tradition is so important, that it is not about our working ourselves into salvation, but really it's the thanksgiving that arises out of our recognition about how undeserved our, God's love for us is, and that frees us, right? So it's a lovely way of tying together so much of what we talked about.
Well, Patrick, thank you for today. Thank you for this conversation and for all the background. I think it's immensely helpful to me and to our community. Grateful for it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Matt. It's really been a blessing to speak with you and the community, and know of my prayers.
Thank you very much, and you're an artist. And thank you for joining. Patrick and I actually recording this on Friday afternoon before the Sunday morning. So blessings for the remainder of July 4th. We'll be together this morning, well, on Sunday morning at 11 o'clock. Grace Flint from the church in Chico, but has been a member of our community in the past, will be our celebrant this morning. And this afternoon at 5 o'clock, our final Jazz Vespers outside. Next week, our final in the session of Theology on Tap at Thursday night at 6:30 with Joel Baden from Yale Divinity School, talking about David, who is a slightly complicated character. So I'm looking forward to talking with Professor Baden about his work on David. Patrick, thank you, and thank you for joining.
Thank you. Bye-bye.